Hello, and welcome to Fortune's Wheelhouse, a podcast about esoterics and the tarot. We will be embarking on a 22-episode journey looking at esoteric imagery in the Major Arcana of the two decks that most everybody knows best, the Rider-Waite-Smith deck and the Thoth deck. I'm Susie Chang, and with me on this journey is Meleen, creator of the Tabula Mundi and Rosetta Tarot decks. Hi, Mel.
Hi, Susie.
So, Mel, tell us a little bit about how you got started in tarot, and I believe that you grew up with a mural of the Wheel of Fortune at your breakfast table.
Yeah, that's right. It was a painting on the wall, a wall-size mural of the Wheel of Fortune from the Rider-Waite-Smith deck, and I used to sit at the kitchen table and eat cereal and stare at it, kind of freaked out by Typhon and whatnot, and that was how it all began.
And we, in our house, was a giant map of Africa in front of the toilet. So I'm really envious of your forward-thinking parents and their woohoo ways. So you first started creating tarot decks, when was it?
I think I started the Rosetta in 2008.
Mm-hmm. And the accompanying book.
And the Book of Seshet, yes.
And then you went on to do a second tarot deck as well.
Yeah, I finished and published Rosetta in 2011, November 2011, and right around the exact same time that it came out, I started the Fool for the Tabula Mundi deck. And that came out as a black and white version it came out as a Major Arcana edition in 2014, a black and white 78 card edition in 2015, and the full 78 card color version in 2016.
And it is absolutely spectacular. Everyone should have a copy, especially you if you're listening to this podcast. And you have an accompanying book with it, too.
Yeah, the book for that is called Book M. Liber Mundi.
The books themselves are an education in tarot, and you should get those, too. As for me, I've been reading tarot probably about 20 years, but it's only in the last couple of years that I've kind of started being all tarot all the time, or all tarot all my free time plus. These days I have an Etsy shop where I sell Arcana cases, which are now trademarked. Those are cases for tarot decks made out of silk and brocade. And I also sell nowadays zodiacal perfumes, so you can check out your sun sign and see and smell like your sun sign.
I'm wearing Sagittarius today.
Are you really? Fantastic. I also do readings in Western Massachusetts. We both live in Western Massachusetts. And the other thing that I'm doing is a book on tarot correspondences for Llewellyn. So that'll be out sometime next year. So Mel, what's your website?
The main blog where there's writing and happenings is www.tabulamundi.com.
And mine is www.etsy.com/shop/tarotista. In case you're wondering about the name of our podcast, Fortune's Wheelhouse, it was a kind of a bright idea that Mel had a while back. And it has to do with the fact that Mel is a Sagittarius and I am a Virgo.
We took the name of the card for the ruler of Sagittarius, Jupiter, whose card is the Wheel of Fortune, and combined it with the Hebrew letter for the ruler of Virgo, which is Bet, meaning house.
Hence, Wheelhouse, Fortune's Wheelhouse. So there you have it. All right, and the last thing I want to say before we get into the actual cards is that our discussion of symbols is going to take us pretty far and pretty fast into Kabbalah and astrology territory. So if you suddenly feel like I'm lost, please stick around. On our website, www.patreon.com/fortuneswheelhouse, we have a ton of explanatory content. All the basic material is free, so you can get a crash course on the Tree of Life and the Zodiac, and you'll be up and running in no time at all. Okay, so with no further ado, we're going to jump right in on our pilot episode and have a look at the Fool. So unless you're driving, you should take out your Rider-Waite-Smith and Thoth versions of the Fool, presuming you have both, or bring them up online if you don't. And while we're at it, we should probably talk about the pronunciation of Thoth, right? So how many versions have you heard?
5 or 6, I think.
Yeah.
Thoth, Toth, Tot, Tote, probably more.
Yeah. And there isn't really any agreement on which one's right. So I think we'll just kind of go with whatever comes out, which in my case is usually Thoth or Thoth.
Likewise.
Yeah. And we hope
I just
that
can't bring myself to call it tote.
it just sounds like, your premium from your public radio contribution. Okay, so that's what we're going to do, and I hope you'll bear with us if you have a variant pronunciation which you feel very strongly about. Okay, so the first thing we're going to do is look at the different titles that go with this card. And in the case of Rider-Waite Smith and Thoth, they happen to be the same. They're just the Fool, right? We also have others. Well, the Hermetic title is the Spirit of the Ether. So that, what does that tell us? That tells us something about it being, I guess, the Fool is apart from the world of the four elements.
Yeah, it's kind of a reference to air in the spiritual and elemental sense, which is a little bit different from air as the way it's used, say, in the sword suit.
Sure. And spirit itself is, kind of a complicated term, and you always get the feeling that they're talking about something that's set apart or different. And that's kind of a good association for the Fool because historically it's been called the unnumbered card, right? So the 0 was actually, I think, wasn't that a Golden Dawn edition that they put the 0 on it? I'm not sure. I think it was part of that whole 0 equals 1 thing that Mathers did. But it was called the unnumbered card because it stood apart from the rest of the deck. And in fact, some people don't even, in the continental tradition, I think they don't even put the Fool at the front necessarily. They might put it at the end or right before the universe. There's a couple different ways to do it. So, but that's why many people call it the unnumbered card. And if you have a Marseille deck, odds are dollars to donuts that there won't be a 0 on it. It'll just say, the Fool, the card without number. It was used historically, it had another name called the excuse, because historically you could play it, like in the game of tarot, you could play it if you didn't want to take your turn. Like you have to play, but if you needed to skip your turn for some strategic points reason, you could play the excuse. And, so it had a certain tactical value to it.
0 as the exemption.
Exactly. The waiver.
I am not.
Okay. So I think a Fool is having two different senses, like either knowing nothing or being mad, and they're, slightly different. So when I look at the Fool card, it's interesting to me to consider whether we're talking about a blank slate or someone who has, sees the world in a kind of gone off the rails, completely different, scrambled eggs for brains kind of way.
Yeah, I'm not a fan of the latter interpretation. I tend to think of it more, not so much as the know nothing, but maybe all potential, which cancels everything out and becomes nothing.
Yeah. I think that's definitely echoed in the Kabbalistic tradition, but we'll talk more about that. Whereas the sort of mad side of the Fool, I think, is kind of, you can see reflections of that in the Dionysus references and the Green Man, but we'll get into that further. So the very first thing we should talk about is astrologically, what is the Fool? Elementally, I should say, I guess.
Elemental air, yeah.
Elemental air, right. Or associated
ether.
Right. As most of you listening to the podcast probably know, the Major Arcana are split up into groups of, category-wise, into groups of 3, 7, and 12. So 3 elements, 7 planets, 12 signs, adding up to 2. And you're like, 3 elements? Why 3? Aren't there 4? And of course, that's because we conflate Saturn and Earth in the world so that we get that number, that all-important number 22. So the Fool is our first element. That's air. And what references to air do we see in these 2 cards?
The first thing that jumps out would be the fact that the Fool in the Rider-Waite deck is about to step off
into thin air.
Into thin air. And then in the Thoth deck, the Fool is kind of standing on air. His feet are not touching the ground. He's got only air.
He seems to be in a 0 gravity environment. He's just floating or hanging there without being seated.
And it's interesting that the Fool also, I always think of he's about to do something. He's not doing, he's about to do. And they both kind of have that sense of inherent potential that they're just the moment before doing.
Right. Okay. And another sort of explicit symbol, I think, that has to do with air and the Fool is his feather in the Rider-Waite Smith version. Feather is common graphic shorthand for air. And in the Rider-Waite Smith deck specifically, there's a recurring motif of the red feather, which you see in the Fool, and you see it also, I believe, in the Sun card, where there's sort of also an upright red plume, which
there's also a connection with the justice or adjustment, ma'at.
Yeah, right. So the idea that you weigh your soul against a feather.
Right, and she often had the feather headdress.
Oh, okay, right.
Then there's the whole Crowley's connection between, the adjustment being the Fool's girlfriend and counterpart.
Ah, really?
Yeah,
wow,
the Aleph,
cool.
Lamed.
Oh, Aleph, Lamed, right.
God and not God. There's a whole long interplay between those two cards. So I kind of think it's neat that there's a feather there to
that's cool. Yeah, I hadn't even realized that. Okay, there's also a red feather in the Rider-Waite Smith death card, only it's drooping, sort of like, unlike this one, which is sort of stretching towards the sun and borne aloft. The other one is sort of succumbing to the will of gravity. Okay, so we also have, think, in the Thoth card, is that a butterfly there? I think it is, around the loop.
Yeah,
there.
There's a butterfly, and right above it, there's a wing. I don't know if you can see that, which I've seen that it's referenced as the wing of Maut, or not sure the Egyptian pronunciation, which is the vulture goddess that was impregnated by air, of another virgin goddess.
Right, and that's why we love the Thoth. It's just like the symbolism is just like right up there on top, rarely hidden. This kind of is a good transition because the Fool stepping off into air, some people say that he's actually stepping into Da'at, the abyss in the Tree of Life, because, as we're about to talk about, the Fool is the first path at the top of the tree, right?
I kind of see it as he's stepping off from Kether all the way down to Malkuth, because you can see in both cards there's references to Kether at the top of the card and Malkuth at the bottom of the card. You see in the Rider-Waite deck the white sun of Kether up there on the right-hand corner, and down below in the opposite corner you see those mountains. They're gray, which kind of makes you think more of Chokmah, but I also think of them as earth, a symbol of earth, and Malkuth. And then over on the Thoth card, you've got the cone of light there on the Fool's head.
It's supposed to be a specific reference to
rainbow
Kether.
Halo kind of around his head that's really faint and pale, but I think those are both Kether references. And then down below you have the crocodile with, it looks to me like there's a rose, maybe his eye is a rose, or there's a there with the crocodile, and to me those are both Malkuth references.
You're right.
Crocodile Sebek or Sobek, and the rose always makes me think of the Princess of Discs, the Earth of Earth, the rose of the Palace of Earth. So it's interesting to me that both cards have Kether at the top of the card and Malkuth at the bottom of the card, and thus kind of like the whole tree encompassed in one card.
And I think we have, in both cases, we have the white brilliance of Kether at the top, the white sun that almost looks like a child's depiction of the sun in the Rider-Waite Smith Fool. And, it's interesting because we see suns throughout both decks, but sometimes it's a reference to Kether and sometimes it's a reference to Tiferet.
You can see in the Thoth card he's got the sun more in the Tifereth position. That's the solar codpiece.
Oh yes,
there.
the solar codpiece. Nice, right? Okay, and let's see. Oh yeah, and so
typical Crowley with the solar codpiece.
I was looking through Snuffin the other day, and this was just on Thursday. I picked it up because I didn't own a copy. I picked it up at the crystal shop where I work, and I was talking to the cashier there, and I was like, literally, the word phallic is on every page in this book.
Why am I not surprised?
But yeah, never an opportunity lost. Let's see. Oh, I saw a really wacko reference here to the Hebrew letter associated with the Fool is
Aleph.
In the Western Mysteries, David Holz's book, it says that the dog is supposed to be the shape of Aleph. It's a bit of a
Is
stretch.
God to be found in a dog?
And, I can sort of see it if I squint a little and, or take off my glasses. He also
Well, he's white. He's the white of Kether, so there's that.
There's also the way he's holding his forepaws is supposed to be reminiscent of Bet, which, I guess so. Other Kabbalistic references. What about the 3 loops? What do you want to say about that?
The 3 veils, Ein Sof, and Ein Sof Or, that the fool technically passes through on his way before even reaching Kether.
Right.
Prior to that first point of brilliance. There's 3 veils of nothing.
3 veils of different qualities of nothingness,
nothing, yes.
just to get us completely ready for more nothing.
The nothing that knows itself, and the nothing that expands into infinite nothing, or something like that.
Something like that. It's probably unknowable anyway. When I read all of this, esoteric material, a lot of the time it's
Ineffable.
like you can't possibly know it anyway. So don't feel bad if you don't understand. Okay, so that's a reference to the 3 veils, as you were saying.
I like the way that they make like a portal around him too.
Oh yes,
that almost like it's like he's passing. His head is through the central one. You see, almost as if he's about to pass through. It's that same about to. He's about to pass through these 3 veils. He's just beginning,
but he's not quite there yet.
Pre-beginning.
Now, on the Rider-Waite-Smith, we also have a reference, probably, maybe, hypothetically, to Kabbalah in the 10 sort of splashes of color on the fool's garment. Those 10 round sort of, I guess they look like 8-spoked wheels, kind of. And there are 10 of them, and, that could well be a reference to the 10 Sephirot on the Tree of Life, if you were counting and
Yeah,
carrying.
the 8-spoked wheel also makes me just think of a compass, the direction, quarters and the cross quarters, the 8 directions. I've
The
also
8-spoked
seen
wheel of
that
the
called
year.
the Star of the Messiah,
Oh, really?
knowing how Waite's Christian mysticism background, it wouldn't surprise me if that was a reference.
I've also, some people think of the 8 spokes. They use that in chaos magic as well, and it's on the 8 of Wands in the Thoth deck. Sort of the 8-fold or the 8-circuit model of consciousness. That could be a reference to that.
Yeah, there's a lot of references. I mean, if you took the quartered circle, then you turn it the other way. One way it's a symbol of earth. The other way it's a symbol of, in astrology, it's the part of fortune.
Oh, that's right. Yeah.
It's the Nox and the Lux symbol, which way you turn it. So combined, It's all of that. Although I'm not sure if that's what Waite was using it in that way.
That's okay, though, right? I mean,
but it's all there.
It's all there. I mean, I think my point of view is that the symbols belong to everybody. It doesn't matter whether the creator of the deck specifically assigned this meaning to this symbol, because we're the ones reading it. Whether or not he or she knew it, they were tapping into, centuries of tradition, millennia of tradition that build up around these signs, and they are ours to interpret. It's the great gift of tarots. I always feel like it's limiting and a little bogus when people say, well, that's not what they meant, because this is tarot. The whole point is to interpret. And if you're not interpreting, then why are you reading tarot at all? Anyway, just my new to 25 cents there.
Another symbol of air in here. It's a little subtle, but the fool is holding in his hand the white rose there, which you might not think of that as a symbol of air, but just something about the way he's holding it. It's almost like he had just sniffed it. And, it's that kind of, and so the sniff of the ingoing breath is one of the meanings of the Hebrew letter Aleph. It's the intake prior to the next card that comes out, which is the word.
And I have seen it said that in terms of the way the Kabbalah assigns the various letters to the parts of the body, that Aleph corresponds with the chest, the way that the magician corresponds with the right eye and the priestess with the right ear, I think. There's probably different ways that they do it, but that would make sense with the, the lungs and the intake of air.
And then there's the rose as the symbol. The rose is actually in both cards, and it's a symbol of, unfolding consciousness, which is something that the Fool's, it's the beginning of that journey that ends at the universe.
And Aleph, of course, is the first of the Hebrew letters, and it is one of the mother letters, the other ones being Mem and Shin. All the mother letters are associated with elements, so Aleph goes with air, Mem goes with water, Shin goes with fire. And it is basically defined, it's associated with ox, right? Because the pictograph is developed from ox. Now, I was just reading something last night that says that these meanings that we commonly use for Hebrew letters are, in a sense, fairly shallow because they were basically like, A is for apple, B is for bear, and like thinking that the apple is somehow meaningful with the letter A. But nevertheless, why shouldn't we use them, right?
Right.
Right.
I thought it was amusing to see Crowley's comment on Aleph as ox. He said the letter is the shape of a plowshare and thus it is a phallic symbol. You might have known that was coming.
Yes, exactly. When you are a hammer, everything looks like a nail.
And
Thanks,
I also
Crowley.
thought of the association with ox and, the king Nebuchadnezzar, who was he was the mad king on his hands and knees eating grass like an ox. So maybe that's a little bit of the madness of the Fool some cards like to show.
There is another sort of numerical Kabbalistic reference in the 14 rays. I didn't actually count them, so I'm just going to make sure. 10, 11, 12, 13. Yeah, indeed, there are 14 rays on the sun in the Fool, which I have seen explained as, 1 for Kether, 2 for Chokmah, and 11 for the path, because we have paths 1 through 10, and then we start counting. We have the Sephirot 1 through 10, and then we start counting paths 11 through 32.
I also wonder if it could have anything to do with the 11 Sephiroth and the 3 veils.
Yeah, why not? Why not?
Why not? I wonder if we should count the rays on the codpiece as well.
Yeah, we definitely should do that.
Get out your magnifying glass.
So that's, this sucks being in your 40s. Okay, 1, 2, 3, 4. Okay, with 3 in between each of them. So it's going to be 16.
Well, there goes that.
Do we care about 16? Well, it's double 8. So that gives us, the north, northwest, and the south, southeast.
And more compass.
All of that stuff.
More compass.
So I really didn't want to get that up close and personal with the Fool's codpiece. Thanks a lot. Oh, there's one astrological and Kabbalah thing we didn't go through, which is the Fool's sack of coins, right? There's all sorts of,
and I don't think we mentioned his path either. Like, the exact path that leads from Kether to
Chokmah.
However you want to.
Yeah, I think it's Kether and it's Chokmah. So
I always feel like I'm clearing my throat when I say Chokmah.
Well, yes, I do too. So that's the path, and it goes from the top of the tree, the crown of Kether, off to what appears from our point of view to be the right looking at the tree, to Chokmah.
Yeah, it's interesting that Crowley's card is facing dead on. Lots of times in the Fool, you see him facing in the other direction, which, if you're looking at the tree, you're like, wait a minute, that's the wrong direction. But I think it's meant to be, the Adam Cadman view, where you step into the perspective of the Fool, and then you are the tree, and that's then on your
There you go.
right.
Window, not mirror, as they say. Yep. So if you imagine yourself into the position of the Fool, you can imagine yourself stepping off to the right into Chokmah.
Or the left.
Or the left, as the case
left,
may be.
yeah.
You're left.
Yeah.
All right. Okay. So, yeah.
Left, right.
Oh, let's talk about color real quick. So we see, what's with this bright yellow color on both of these cards?
Well, the Golden Dawn had the color scales, which is a 4-fold scale of color, one for each of the 4 worlds. And the primary color of every path is the first one in the King scale, which in this case for the Fool is not just yellow, but it's called bright pale yellow. And it's interesting to me that, the next card, the Magus, its color in the King scale is yellow, just yellow. This is bright pale yellow. So it makes me think, these two cards they're very much intertwined. They're almost like 2 aspects of the same thing. In this case, with the Fool's proximity to Kether being slightly greater.
So
there's a
luminescence.
some white coming through that yellow, making the bright pale yellow.
And when we talk about the scales, so, we talk about king, queen, prince, and princess scale, but isn't that also the same as saying, the four worlds? You can say the color in Atziluth, Bria, Yetzirah, and Asiya. So one thing that we'll see is that when we look at the paths, they are generally, when you see a representation of the tree of life, the paths are generally colored in Atzilut.
The king scale.
In the king
right,
scale.
And the Sephiroth are generally colored in the queen scale. That's the diagram Minitum Mundum.
Exactly. So those two systems of color are kind of working in tandem together, and I assume it's sort of like a balance of male and female.
Yeah, the rationale is that the Sephiroth received the influence of the paths, which are more of it's like a force form thing.
Sure,
going
exactly.
on.
Right. So hence the paths are assigned this quote unquote masculine quality, whereas the Sephiroth, the unknowable Sephiroth, are assigned this quote unquote feminine receptive quality, which leads to various other esoteric implications down the line when you figure out, like, color is tied to sound, planets are assigned both to Sephiroth and to paths. So there's these sort of confusing ramifications, but that's the system underlying it. Okay.
So we've also got the other colors, which the queen scale is sky blue.
You are doing this from memory, aren't you? You're scary.
I kind of have painted them all twice now, and I just started my third round because I'm painting a third deck, and I've just finished the Fool, the Magus, and starting the Priestess, so they're very fresh.
Okay, so Queen is sky blue. I'm checking you on my little list here.
Sky blue and emerald green for the Prince, and then the Princess has that same emerald with some flecks of gold in it.
Gold, exactly, right. Right. So, and which do we get to see that illustrated on the cards at all, or do they just pretty much stick with the king scale bright pale yellow?
The Rider-Waite deck doesn't necessarily follow the color scales so much. I don't know if that's a limitation in the available printing technology at the time, so they did things differently. The Thoth deck generally adheres to the Golden Dawn color scales very much so, where the green's very prevalent. The golds and the greens are very much in evidence on Crowley's card.
Let's see. All right, so moving on from color, numeric references. Well, it's a 0. I mean, you could read all kinds of zeros into these forms. I mean, even the 3 loops.
The 3 veils are zeros, in a sense that they always kind of look like that around the Tree of Life. You see that.
All right, so let's see. We should probably see if there's any other symbols that we haven't specifically talked about.
Oh, sure. There's probably
tons,
lots in there.
Tons and tons and tons. So you mentioned the vulture, Moot.
We've got the caduceus on the central circular veil there.
So what's going on with that? Is that like a preview of the Magus?
I believe so. Those two cards are so very intertwined that they share a lot of esoteric meaning and symbolism. I think that's an evidence of that. There's the reference, the winged sun there, the hadith, and the serpents on the wand. So it's definitely a preview of the next card.
And there's also, I think I deliberately avoided this, but right below between his legs, that is a Tree of Life reference there. The rose, there's sort of a rose, and then there's 2 flowers coming off of it.
Yeah, that's a real strange one. I have often looked at it and thought of the 3 supernals, Kether, Bina.
Being number 3, and there are 3 flowers there.
And then I think Crowley himself referred to it as a threefold benediction that I think was referring to the final hay of the Tetragrammaton.
Really?
Where the first 3 worlds or 3 letters or 3 elements are then fully realized in the 4th one, in the element of earth. So it's kind of maybe an alchemical thing too, because underneath it there you see those
intertwined figures
that look like squiggles, but they're supposed to be embracing infants, which makes me think of
Or throttling.
The sun card and the twins. Horus is the two twins, the Rahorkuit and Horpakrat, the solar twins. And I think that's what he's getting at there. Somehow that between the interplay of those three, I don't know if they're roses or lilies or some of each, but
Looks
it
like
almost
roses
looks
to
like
me.
the one at top is a fully open rose and maybe some other stages beneath. The interplay of the three supernals is what gives birth to the solar Horus.
And then you have the tiger and the crocodile. We talked about the crocodile is Sebek or Sobek. And what is his, do you think he's sort of fulfilling the same function as the dog does in the Rider-Waite-Smith, a sort of, warning or
I
threat?
see the tiger and the dog as being correlated. And I guess if you had to pick a correlation between the crocodile and with something in Waite's card, I would say the mountains below. That's just me. I mean,
That's right, because you correlate the crocodile with Earth. It's on your Ace of Discs cards.
Yeah.
I can totally see that. Right. Let's see.
and there's a little moon there too above the crocodile's head. You can see that
Yes, there is.
tiny little crescent.
You are right. And so again, the moon could be Yesod and the crocodile.
We've got the codpiece sun and the
Yeah.
moon. So we've got the, and in between them are the embracing infants and then the supernals. Yes, if that's
It's like a miniature
if
tree of
that's
life.
what that is.
And as you said, the rose in the crocodile's eyes as Malkut, right? I also have a note on my page here, and I have no idea what I wrote that down for because I did this really late last night and I wasn't thinking straight. But I have a Saturn glyph noted next to the crocodile, and I assume that. Again, that's also could
Earth,
go with
universe,
Earth,
yeah.
Malkut, universe, but there may be some kind of Saturnine association with the crocodile that goes with that.
We were talking about the crocodile. We didn't mention the crocodile's association with Harpocrates,
yes,
the silent
right.
twin of the solar twins, the counterpart of that fool.
Is he like an analog for Harpocrates? Is he when you see the crocodile?
Yeah,
are you
there's
supposed to
several
think of-
references. Harpocrates was said to have a crocodile that followed him, kind of like a devouring beast. And I still maintain that it refers to Malkuth because, life is hard. Incarnation is a devouring beast, right? So, but there's other portrayals of the child Horus, who's also Harpocrates, Horpakrat, where he's standing on the back of two crocodiles. And he's got actually snakes. He's holding a snake in each hand, and he's got his foot planted on the head of two crocodiles, and he's like mastering these forces or these beasts.
Right. And when we talk about Horpakrat or Harpocrates, aren't we also, that's where we get the sign of silence,
Yes.
right? So, which of course goes with your association of the crocodile with Malkut, with discs, with the final riddle of the Sphinx.
To be silent.
Right? To be silent.
To be silent and to go. So it's that silence before the breath comes out and you speak in the next card with the logos or the word. And it's that silence that you have to maintain in order to move forward. If you're just talking, you're not doing.
Okay, and we have in the upper left corner crystal. I assume that's another sort of crystallization of matter kind of reference.
Yeah, I've read that that's actually the bottom of the cup. You can see there's a cup there,
Yes.
and it's pouring out water, and in his other hand, there's a
Fire.
flaming pine cone is what it's supposed to be.
Yes.
So he's alchemically mixing fire and water, which, of course, if you can imagine what might happen when you do that, you get air, a deal of steam.
Right. And I guess that's a reference to the whole idea that fire and water give rise to air, or is the offspring of air, which from a modern perspective is kind of not the most logical thing, but from an elemental, spiritual, mystical perspective makes some sense. The one thing we haven't talked about in this card is the sort of Green Man, Pan, Dionysus references, which you see starting with the grapes and the three loops are actually a grapevine, I think. They're supposed to be coming out of
and there's
that
a
grape.
big cluster of grapes there, and above the bag of coins there.
And the horns. He's got horns.
Yeah, he's got the horns of Bacchus. So I think I've always kind of been amused by the contrast between these two cards. The fool is said to be androgynous, and there's a way of portraying Bacchus as bisexual or double-natured, which again brings in the solar twins in a sense. But the one way of portraying that is to kind of have a young, effeminate male, and you kind of see that in Waite's card with the, you know, tra-la-la in his Renaissance garb. The other fool is, you know, very much more masculine with his solar codpiece and his green man muscular torso there.
Exactly, and his sort of implied fertility and virility.
Yeah, and he's much more pan, kind of bringing out the fact that the Fool and the Devil are two cards that are associated with each other because they both have that, they call Pan the all-begetting, the all-devourer, which kind of makes me think, the all-begetting makes me think of the energy of the Fool.
There is that dove in the corner, and when there's a dove, I never know quite whether to, you know, interpret that as grace, divine grace, or the feminine principle, or a spirit. What do you think it is?
Yeah, I mean, a lot of times that's the descent of spirit into matter, which is again what we're seeing from all the way from, you know, where this path is from Kether to Chokhmah, but it continues on all the way down the tree. So
right,
I
in
think
fact,
it's
there's
another
that whole trope of the serpent winding up the tree and the dove coming down the tree.
Yeah,
right?
I think it's a lot about the descent of spirit into matter.
Okay,
And you know, this path too, I was also thinking about, you know, Kether as being the null, the zero or the pre-zero, the null situation, whereas the Fool is kind of like Kether as that first point, and then it's on its way to Chokhmah, which I think of as the line. So you have the nothing, the point arises, and then you have the line, and it's kind of like a natural progression of form eventually.
and then Bina, what you have the square or the plane.
Yeah, the triangle, I guess.
That's what I like to call lights, camera, action. Right. Okay. Anything else that we saw that we didn't miss? Shall we go on to associations that we don't see? You know what I did, which is kind of cool. So some of the natural correspondences, real quick, that go with air are the aspen, the peppermint, things that tend to have a sharp, airy quality to them. So the esoteric association for air in perfume is galbanum. So I actually brought my galbanum downstairs for us to smell if you want to. Have you ever smelled galbanum? Should I warn you?
I don't remember. I think I have, but I've forgotten.
Well, it used to be, I mean, I think it was considered a perfume ingredient in ancient times, and it's still used today, but it's quite aggressive. And I've used galbanum in my air perfumes, but I put like half a drop because it's described as grassy oily, but you can see it's a clear liquid, but have a smell. Nice. What do you think? You like it?
I like it.
You don't mind it? Okay, so because it has a sort of a bitterness, it's considered a base note as opposed to a heart note or a top note because it
tend
lingers.
to like those.
Yeah, you're very bassy. So yeah, that's galbanum, and when I use it, I just use a little bit because it's so persistent, and its bitterness tends to drown out other subtler notes. But anyway, so that's what it is, and not that many people know about it today, but apparently it was a pretty well-known fragrance component once upon a time because you see it in all of the magical correspondences to either air or air signs, Libra, Aquarius, Gemini. And the other thing that we talked about including is the note, the musical note, which happens to be an E natural. Now, I'm going to tell you really, I don't know if you know how the color scales and the musical scales work. Do you know how that?
Why don't you tell us?
Okay, so let me see if I can do this right. So the way I've seen it represented, you have 7 colors in the rainbow, basically. You have 7 notes in the scale, basically. And you can...
7 classical planets.
Seven classical planets, exactly. And then, so what you can do is you can say the color red at the beginning of the rainbow corresponds with the note C. And which planet corresponds to red? Well, here's the problem, because we were talking about 2 different systems of attribution. We have planets that are associated with Sephirot in their Briatic colors, Queen scale, and we have planets that are associated with paths in their Atziluthic king scale colors. So when you say, red, we could be talking about, well, in the case of red, it doesn't matter because both Mars is red, both in the Path of the Tower, the Atziluthic King scale, and as the Sephira Gevura in the Briatic scale. Yes, I got through it. Okay, so, however, as you go through the colors for the other planets, it's not so neat. They're not the same. So for example, when we get to the Magician, we'll be dealing with yellow in the Atziluthic scale, but Mercury is actually orange in the Sephirotic scale. So anyway, regardless, the note for the Fool is E natural because C, D, E, red, orange, yellow, and the Fool is associated with yellow. And although you would probably prefer that I have a pitch pipe or something, I can actually tell you what E natural sounds like because I have absolute pitch. So this is what E natural sounds like, roughly, more or less. The problem with absolute pitch is that it does tend to degrade a little as you get older, like everything else. Okay, so that's done with. Okay, well, I think we've covered it pretty well. Good? Good. So thanks for bearing with us through our extended discussion of the Fool, and be sure to tune in next time for the Magus or Magician.